Marcus Reed and Callum Drayton, two kings from different worlds, turned Manchester's streets into a graveyard of ambition, loyalty, and betrayal. What began as a silent business move soon exploded into one of the bloodiest turf wars the UK had ever seen, where power had no mercy, and every victory came with a body count. Please subscribe for daily new update of crime story and watch till end. In 2012, Manchester was a city divided by music, money, and crime. Hidden behind its modern skyline and busy nightlife was a dark economy where drugs, weapons, and stolen goods changed hands faster than the police could react. Into this fragile ecosystem arrived a new name, the Kingsmen crew. They came from Chicago, not as tourists or businessmen, but as ex-street hustlers with experience in running underground networks. Their leader, Marcus Reed, was a man shaped by the streets, a quiet, disciplined strategist who had survived shootouts, betrayals, and prison time. He didn't believe in chaos, he believed in control. Marcus saw the UK as an untapped market. The local gangs were divided, fighting over small corners of cities while the demand for narcotics kept rising. His crew had connections in South America and Europe, which meant they could import high-grade product directly. Within months, they found their way into Manchester's underworld through a string of illegal nightclubs and underground parties. Cash flowed easily, and for a short while, everything went according to plan. They operated quietly, paid off small-time dealers, and avoided unnecessary violence. But power never goes unnoticed. The local crime scene was already dominated by a ruthless British gang called the Grimvale Syndicate. Its leader, Callum the Crow Drayton, had ruled Manchester's underworld for nearly a decade. He was a man who didn't speak much but controlled everything, from protection rackets to gun smuggling. His crew was feared across the north of England, known for brutal discipline and silent disappearances of anyone who crossed them. When word reached him that a foreign crew was making money on his turf, he took it as an insult. At first, Callum tried to test them quietly. He sent men to gather information: who they were, where they came from, and how much they were making. What he found out was unsettling. The Kingsmen weren't small players, they were organized, financed, and dangerous. They had money, connections, and soldiers who'd fought for territory in Chicago's deadliest neighborhoods. Marcus didn't operate like a typical street thug. He built systems, controlled entry points, coded messages, and offshore accounts. He turned crime into business, and that made him more dangerous than anyone Callum had faced. Callum made his first move by intercepting one of their shipments. A van carrying imported drugs was hijacked outside Stockport. The men inside were found dead hours later, their bodies dumped near a canal. It was a clear message: the UK was not for sale. Marcus received the news in silence. His men expected an immediate retaliation, but Marcus believed in timing. Instead of attacking blindly, he studied Callum's operation, tracing every connection, every weakness. He bribed people close to the syndicate, paid informants, and waited. Then, without warning, a few weeks later, an explosion destroyed one of Callum's bars in the city center. It wasn't just an attack, it was a statement. That night, Manchester changed forever. The Grimvale Syndicate realized the Americans weren't leaving, and the Kingsmen knew the war had just begun. In the shadows of the city's lights, two empires prepared for a bloody battle that would soon turn Manchester into a war zone. And neither Marcus nor Callum had any idea how far this conflict would take them, or how many would die before it ended. The first strike had drawn blood, and the city felt it. Word spread fast through Manchester's underground. 3 Americans were dead, and a local bar had gone up in flames. The balance of power had shifted overnight, and now both sides were watching every street corner, every parked car, and every stranger. Marcus Reed knew that retaliation was expected, but he also knew the cost of rushing into a trap. He wanted precision, not chaos. For the next few weeks, he ordered his crew to disappear. No phone calls, no meetings, no shipments. To the outside world, it looked as if the Kingsmen had backed off. In truth, they were waiting for the right moment to strike. The Grimvale Syndicate misread the silence as fear. Callum Drayton saw it as a victory and became bolder. His men started taking over more street corners, collecting money from smaller gangs, and bragging about how the Americans had folded. That arrogance proved costly. Hidden among his runners were people Marcus had already bought. Through them, Marcus learned about the syndicate's stash houses, safe spots, and key players. He mapped the entire operation like a general studying an enemy before war. When the first move came, it was fast and ruthless. One of Grimvale's main drug suppliers was found murdered inside his apartment, and the entire shipment he guarded vanished. 2 days later, a second supplier's car exploded in the middle of the night. The attacks weren't random, each hit weakened Callum's financial backbone. Within weeks, the syndicate was losing money and control. The police noticed the rising violence, but had no leads, witnesses were terrified, and the city's criminal network had gone silent out of fear. Marcus was not just fighting for territory, he was sending a message. Every move was calculated. Every body left behind carried a purpose. He believed in dominance through fear and precision, not public bloodbaths. But as the hits continued, control began to slip from both sides. Smaller crews saw an opportunity to rise, turning the city into a playground for chaos. Gunfire became common in once quiet neighborhoods, and car bombings turned nightlife districts into danger zones. Innocent lives began to fall victim to a war they didn't understand. Callum Drayton, furious and humiliated, decided to retaliate with force. He hired a new enforcer, a brutal man named Dean Lockett, known for his lack of mercy. Dean didn't care about strategy. He believed in He kidnapped one of Marcus's lieutenants, tortured him for information, and dumped his body outside a warehouse, with a crow symbol carved into his chest. The signature mark of the Grimvale Syndicate. It was a declaration of total war. Marcus responded instantly. Within 48 hours, Dean's car was found riddled with bullets. His death ignited an unstoppable chain reaction. The war that had started quietly with a few deaths now spiraled into something uncontrollable. Streets turned into killing grounds, and no one trusted anyone. Both the Kingsmen and Grimvale began losing their own people to betrayal, greed, and revenge. The police formed a special task force, but by then the violence had spread to neighboring cities. The once profitable business of drugs and smuggling became an all-out campaign of destruction. What had started as a power play between two men now grew into one of the bloodiest gang wars Britain had ever seen, and in the smoke and confusion, neither Marcus nor Callum realized that their empires were beginning to crumble from within. By 2014, the war between the Kingsmen crew and the Grimvale Syndicate had escaped the borders of Manchester and spilled into other cities. What began as a local power struggle was now a national conflict fought in silence, shadows, and blood. Birmingham became the new battleground. A nightclub known as the Vault, once a neutral ground for drug trades, was bombed during a weekend party, killing 7 people. 2 days later, a car in Liverpool exploded outside a warehouse tied to the Kingsmen. Every act of violence led to another, a cycle of retaliation that no one could stop. The British tabloids started calling it the Transatlantic War, though no one really knew how deep it went. Marcus Reed had become more cautious, but also more ruthless. The early losses had changed him. His once calm demeanor hardened into paranoia. He trusted no one outside his inner circle, and even they felt his growing suspicion. To strengthen his forces, he brought in reinforcements from the United States. Among them was Derek Cole, a man whose reputation stretched from Chicago to Detroit. Derek wasn't loud or flashy. He was a ghost, a professional cleaner who handled problems with silent efficiency. His arrival marked a turning point in the war. Under his coordination, the Kingsmen launched a brutal campaign targeting the syndicate's financial pipelines. Arms suppliers vanished. Account handlers went missing. Safe houses burned in the night. Callum Drayton, on the other hand, wasn't the type to retreat. His empire was bleeding, but he knew how to adapt. He reached beyond the British borders and formed alliances with a group of Eastern European smugglers who had been looking to expand their presence in the UK. In exchange for territory and protection, They provided him with weapons and soldiers who didn't hesitate to kill. With this new power behind him, Callum restructured his gang into a more militarized operation. Every man under him carried a weapon, and every deal was guarded like a battlefield. The violence grew deadlier, and the rules that once governed the underworld vanished. Assassinations happened in daylight. Police informants disappeared before they could testify. The task force created to end the bloodshed was constantly one step behind, unable to stop the flow of bodies. Each side believed they were close to victory, but both were losing control. Amid the chaos was Ethan Price, one of Marcus Reed's most trusted men. Ethan had been with Marcus since the early days, running logistics and managing operations in northern England, but unknown to Marcus, Ethan had grown tired of the constant bloodshed. Secretly, he made contact with British intelligence through a handler posing as a club manager. Ethan offered inside information in exchange for immunity and a new life. The government saw him as their way to dismantle both empires. Ethan began feeding them everything: shipment details, warehouse locations, names of distributors. His reports led to quiet raids that crippled both sides, though no one suspected the leak came from within. Marcus believed the syndicate had planted a mole, while Callum was convinced it was the Americans. Both leaders tightened their circles, unaware that the man sitting closest to Marcus was slowly pulling the entire empire down from the inside. The blood spilled in Manchester had now reached across the country. Every city bore scars of the conflict, but the deadliest blow hadn't yet been struck. The betrayal was still hidden, waiting to ignite a final explosion that neither side could recover from. Ethan Price had lived a double life long enough to know that every lie had an expiration date. By the time he began feeding intelligence to the authorities, the gang war had already reached a point of no return. He told himself he was doing it for survival, not redemption. He had seen too many bodies, too many pointless killings, and he no longer believed in Marcus Reed's dream of expansion. Ethan had been promised witness protection, a new identity, and a way out of the madness. But in a world built on greed and violence, freedom was never simple. Every secret he passed to his handlers came with a price, and each meeting pushed him closer to discovery. For months, his deception went unnoticed. The raids on warehouses and drug shipments appeared random, and Marcus assumed the Grimvale Syndicate had inside help from corrupt officials. But the closer Ethan got to the end, the more reckless he became. He stopped covering his digital tracks, made encrypted calls from unsecured locations, and started showing signs of fear during meetings. Derek Cole noticed it first. Derek had no proof, but his instincts told him something was wrong. He reported his suspicions to Marcus, who dismissed them, refusing to believe one of his oldest men could betray him. That decision would destroy everything. Meanwhile, the Grimvale Syndicate had their own eyes on Ethan. Callum Drayton's new allies from Eastern Europe brought with them a skilled hacker named Radoslav Varga, who specialized in tracing encrypted communications. During a cyber sweep meant to intercept police activity, Radoslav found fragments of Ethan's calls. It didn't take long for the syndicate to piece the puzzle together. They realized the leak wasn't coming from their side. It was coming from inside the Kingsmen crew. Callum saw an opportunity. Instead of killing Ethan immediately, he decided to use him as bait. A week later, fake documents began circulating on the dark web, implying that Ethan had been working with the Grimvale Syndicate all along. The files listed bank transfers, coded messages, and supposed meetings that painted him as a double agent betraying the Americans to their rivals. The information made its way to the Kingsmen through channels Marcus trusted. The effect was instant. Marcus ordered Ethan's arrest without hesitation. Derek Cole and 2 other men dragged Ethan to an abandoned mill on the edge of Salford, a place once used to store shipments. Ethan tried to explain, but no one listened. His death was swift, silent, and merciless. His body was buried beneath the floor. The concrete poured over him before sunrise. Days later, Marcus received a call from a contact in law enforcement, confirming that Ethan had been working with British intelligence to dismantle both gangs. The revelation broke him. For the first time in years, Marcus felt something close to regret. The man he had trusted most, the one who might have saved them, was gone, and it was his own hand that had ended him. When news of Ethan's death reached Callum Drayton, he smiled coldly. His plan had worked better than expected. With Ethan gone, the intelligence link was severed, and the Kingsmen were left blind. Marcus spiraled into anger and paranoia, and his leadership began to crumble. He saw enemies in every corner, questioned his allies, and made decisions driven by rage instead of reason. The Grimvale Syndicate used the chaos to tighten their grip, moving in on key territories and striking harder than never before. What Marcus didn't realize was that Ethan's death had set off a chain reaction that neither side could control. The war was no longer about money or territory. It had become a personal vendetta, built on lies, loss, and revenge. And as both empires began to collapse, Manchester stood on the edge of an explosion that would burn everything to the ground. The aftermath of Ethan Price's death left Marcus Reed a shadow of the man he once was. The calm strategist who had built the Kingsmen from the ground up was gone, replaced by a paranoid and wounded leader driven purely by vengeance. His inner circle had grown smaller, his trust reduced to no one but Derek Cole. The warehouse where Ethan had been killed now stood abandoned, yet Marcus often returned there, pacing through the concrete floors as if haunted by the ghost of his betrayal. He knew the Grimvale Syndicate had manipulated him, but he couldn't undo what he'd done. The guilt twisted into rage, and that rage demanded blood. Callum Drayton, on the other side of the city, was preparing his final strike. The syndicate had grown stronger through alliances with Eastern European smugglers, but the violence had drawn unwanted attention. Law enforcement had begun tightening its grip, raiding safe houses, and intercepting shipments at the docks. Callum knew the war couldn't continue much longer. It had become too loud, too messy. He wanted to end it decisively, with one brutal attack that would wipe out the Kingsmen for good. His men had tracked down their main base of operations, a heavily guarded warehouse in Salford used to store weapons, drugs, and cash. It was the perfect target. The assault began before dawn. A convoy of black vans arrived silently, and heavily armed men poured out, surrounding the warehouse. The first explosion tore through the steel doors, followed by a hail of bullets that shattered the morning calm. Inside, Marcus and his men returned fire, but they were outnumbered and cornered. Derek Cole fought like a machine, holding off attackers long enough for Marcus to escape through a back exit. Smoke filled the air as gunfire echoed across the industrial district. By the time police arrived, the warehouse was an inferno. Bodies littered the ground, and both gangs had taken heavy losses. Marcus escaped, bleeding from a gunshot wound, with Derek dragging him to a stolen car. They drove through the empty streets until they found refuge in an abandoned factory outside the city. Marcus's mind raced as he realized the inevitable. The Kingsmen were finished. His network was gone, his money seized, and most of his men either dead or captured. For years he had believed he could control the chaos, but now he saw the truth. No one ever controlled it. The Underworld consumed everyone who tried. Meanwhile, Callum Drayton's victory was short-lived. Within weeks, police raids, triggered by the remnants of Ethan's earlier intelligence, hit every syndicate operation across the country. His trusted lieutenants were arrested, and his accounts frozen. The Eastern European allies who once stood beside him vanished overnight, taking what remained of his money. Callum fled to London, trying to rebuild, but his empire had collapsed. A sting operation by undercover agents, posing as arms dealers, finally trapped him. When he was arrested, he didn't resist. He simply stared at the flashing lights with the calm acceptance of a man who had already lost everything. Marcus Reed wasn't as lucky. His wounds led him to a hospital, where he checked in under a false name. But the police had been tracking him for weeks. 2 officers walked into his room one morning and ended a manhunt that had crossed borders and claimed countless lives. Derek Cole, the last of the Kingsmen loyalists, vanished into thin air. Some believed he escaped the country. Others said he was killed and buried in one of the many unmarked graves left by the war. The turf war that had started as a quiet invasion ended in total ruin. Both empires were gone, both leaders captured, and the cities they fought over scarred forever. The once booming criminal networks that fueled the streets had fallen silent. For the first time in years, Manchester's nights were calm, but beneath that calm lay the echoes of gunfire, betrayal, and ambition that had destroyed two men who wanted everything and ended up with nothing. By 2016, the war that had drenched Manchester in fear and violence was finally over. The Kingsmen crew and the Grimvale Syndicate, two names once whispered with terror, had vanished into history, replaced by police reports, prison records, and fading graffiti, yet the echoes of their conflict never really disappeared. The streets they fought for still carried the scars of gunfire, burned warehouses, and bodies buried under concrete. To the ordinary people, peace had returned, but for those who had lived through the years of bloodshed, the silence felt uneasy, like the calm before another storm. Marcus Reed and Callum Drayton were both behind bars now, held in separate maximum security prisons under heavy surveillance. Marcus spent most of his time in isolation, replaying every choice that had led him there. The once proud leader who believed he could outsmart everyone had lost everything: his empire, his men, and his reputation. He never spoke to other inmates, rarely ate, and spent hours staring at the blank walls of his cell. The weight of Ethan Price's death haunted him most. In his dreams he saw the man's face, loyal, scared, and betrayed. Guilt became his only companion, and though the world outside had moved on, Marcus remained trapped in the past, counting the ghosts that still followed him. Callum Drayton, in another prison hundreds of miles away, faced a different fate. Unlike Marcus, he adapted quickly. He bribed guards, built alliances with other inmates, and still ran small operations through smuggled phones. The Grimvale Syndicate no longer existed, but fragments of his network survived in hidden corners of the underworld. Even from behind bars, Callum's influence lingered. Yet deep down, he knew the golden days were over. The criminal world had changed. The old rules of loyalty and silence were gone, replaced by reckless younger gangs chasing fame and fast money. He had become a relic, a story used by new crews to measure their ambition. In Manchester, the void left by the fall of both empires didn't last long. Smaller gangs began rise, younger and more unpredictable than their predecessors. They didn't follow codes or traditions. They filmed their crimes, bragged online, and used violence as a language of power. These new players didn't care about the past. They cared about visibility. The old generation, the ones who had fought in the war, watched in silence, realizing that what they had built from blood and fear was now entertainment for a new world. The police called it a victory. Crime rates had fallen, and major networks had been dismantled. But those who understood the streets knew that crime never truly disappeared. It simply changed shape. The ghosts of the Kingsmen and Grimvale were still there, hidden in whispers, graffiti tags, and unmarked graves. Their story became a warning, passed from one generation to the next. Power built on blood will always collapse on itself. Years later, investigators would still find traces of their empire: forgotten storage units, offshore accounts, and coded ledgers that hinted at millions lost in the shadows. Some claimed that Derek Cole, the vanished enforcer, was still alive, moving through Europe under a new name, carrying what remained of Marcus Reed's fortune. Others said he died in the final battle, buried in the ruins of the warehouse that ended it all. The truth no longer mattered. What remained was legend, the story of two men who believed they could conquer a country's underworld, and ended up destroying it instead. Their war had no heroes, only survivors and ghosts. And in the quiet streets of Manchester, where the city lights glowed over forgotten bloodstains, people still whispered about the time when America's crew met the UK's underworld, and turned the nation's crime scene into its bloodiest battlefield.